Yeah, such an honor to have you here. But for those of the audience who don't know you already, can you just introduce yourself a little bit, what you do and what are your interests?
Sure. So my name is Angel Tang. I'm a practicing lawyer in New York. A little bit of background about me and my legal background is that I went to law school at the University of Michigan. That's where I got my JD. I interned at the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York City during my time in law school. After graduating, I went on to work at one of the top law firms in the country. So I feel very blessed that I had all these great opportunities. And then right now, my biggest hobby is my 3-year-old daughter. So
you mentioned your legal background. I guess, for many of us who are living in the United States right now, the sort of the pressing matter on our mind is what happened on Capitol Hill yesterday. Yes. So it was a saddening day for many of us. And as you know, we have this president who lost his presidency in November, lost again on Tuesday, the Senate, and on Wednesday, a president who basically has nothing left to lose. Right. President Trump fomented a mob to attack the U.S. Congress in the hope of pressuring lawmakers to install him as president for another term. Second, impeachment, treason, those are not terms to be used lightly, but there has been many discussions among even some members of Trump's own cabinet and his allies over invoking the 25th Amendment, which is a potential vehicle for removing the president from office. So I want to start by discussing that topic. Can you introduce to us some of the sort of the legal consequences of what happened yesterday and what are some of the potential implications for President Trump himself and his allies?
So I just want to begin with, my personal legal opinion, which is, yes, I absolutely think Trump should be prosecuted in some way for inciting violence and encouraging his supporters to storm the Capitol. We have to first acknowledge the complete insanity that happened yesterday, the abnormality that encapsulated the events of yesterday. There were improvised explosives planted by rioters. A woman was shot. The National Guard was called in. The FBI was called in. Mobsters, aka Trump's civilian army, were coordinated and violent. And it's just not the America that we should stand for. And this is a far cry from the Black Lives Matter protest. And in my opinion, this is an impeachable act. And the fact that Trump only has mere days left in office does not change my assessment of that. The trickier question, which you posed, and I think it's a really good question, is whether I think in practical terms, whether Trump will be prosecuted or impeached. And sadly, I want to say no. I think the answer is no. I don't think there's enough Republican support. I don't think there's enough public appetite. I think there's fear of further divisioning the country. And I also think that as a Republican representative in this country, I would be terrified at this point to go against Trump and his supporters. I don't want my house vandalized and everything like that. So in theory, yes. In practical terms, I don't think so, which is deeply upsetting.
I see. But, this is hardly the first legal peril President Trump faces. For 4 years, Trump has benefited from sort of de facto immunity from prosecution that, all presidents enjoy while in office. But on January the 20th, when Joe Biden is sworn in, then Trump is basically left out in legal cold. I mean, let's be clear, there's no sort of imminent sign that, indictment is going to be placed. And it's completely possible that Trump could emerge entirely unscathed. But there's also no doubt that, once he's out of the office, he will be facing a higher level of legal jeopardy, basically, than in the past 4 years. So I wanted to, take this opportunity to invite you to give us some basic knowledge about sort of the likely lawsuits that Trump is likely to face, and what are some of the likely prosecutions and charges he's likely to face.
Sure. Yes. So that's a great question. And it's also something that I've been pondering for a while lately. And Trump is such a unique character. In America's 245-year-old history, the country's never prosecuted a president. And with the exception of impeachment stuff, which, isn't exactly what we're talking about here, right?
Right.
However, it's easy for me to understand why our country is reluctant to prosecute former presidents, even when it comes to a president as controversial as Trump. Because on the one hand, you don't want to further divide the country and set a dangerous precedent. On the other hand, we are a nation of laws, and not even the president is above the law. So that's another issue. So we kind of have to balance between those things. And I think the good thing about it is we don't just have to look at one body of like one organization to go after Trump, right? We have the federal government, we have the states, we have local, we have civilians, we have government agencies. So let's take a look at the legal challenges Trump will likely face once
Sure.
he's out of office.
Sure.
So you mentioned quite correctly about sovereign immunity. Before we get into all of that, it's important to understand the concept of sovereign immunity. Once Trump isn't in office anymore, he will lose that benefit of sovereign immunity. And sovereign immunity, for those that don't know, it serves as a sort of legal shield with respect to the president or any like other government representatives, certain other government representatives. And what is sovereign immunity exactly? So two Supreme Court cases clarifies this for us. And one of them is Nixon versus Fitzgerald in 1982, where the Supreme Court established that the president has absolute immunity from civil prosecution while he's in office, but not criminal. And then we have 15 years later in Clinton v. Jones that the president has sovereign immunity, but it does not cover acts that happened before he became president or after. So that gives us some guidance. And per that, those two cases, and now that we've covered sovereign immunity and why Trump's election loss is such a devastating blow to his ability to fend off legal challenges, we can take a deep dive into the two investigations that I find to be the strongest cases against Trump. So I personally believe that the strongest legal case against Trump should have the three following characteristics: to avoid possible outcry, to avoid what happened yesterday again, and just to avoid setting a dangerous precedent for future presidents. And I think the case should be not politicized. So something like the Mueller probe, I don't think should be the thing that we should go after Trump for, because it's such a politicized issue. I think number two, it should ideally be something that Trump has done prior to coming into the presidency. So he's covered under that Supreme Court ruling where, he doesn't have sovereign immunity, so we don't have to deal with sovereign immunity issues. And number three, I think it should be a case that's brought on either the state or local level, because what if he gets a pardon and that'll pardon his federal crimes? What if, he steps down, temporarily gives Pence the, temporary presidential powers, he pardons Trump, and now he has pardon, right? So I think Trump is not beneath doing that. So that's why I want to talk about the federal cases last, even though they're very, very important. But let's start with the ones that I think are the strongest. And I think it's tax fraud. And sorry to your viewers, because I know tax fraud is probably one of the least sexiest things that you could go after someone for. Most people don't really understand it. It's complicated, but it's also very black and white, right? Like you have organizations as big as the mafia, and they murder, they rob, they do all these violent crimes. But at the end of the day, we get them from tax fraud, right? And what we know is that for Trump's organization, before he became president, I believe, he paid $747,622 to his daughter, Ivanka Trump's consulting company, while she was simultaneously an employee. And that's like kind of double dipping. You're not supposed to simultaneously be an employee and also be a consultant. And that's a way to minimize your tax liabilities. So New York Attorney General is looking into that, as well as the Manhattan DA. So we have that, which I think is the most solid case. And because it's not politicized, it's something that happened before he became president, and it's local, state level. So like I said, sadly, the tax code's complicated, it's boring, but I believe it's the most clean and elegant case we have against Trump. But my fear is Ivanka Trump will go to prison before Trump, or for this one. Because, Trump can say, hey, I didn't know that, my accountant paid Ivanka consulting fees, and you know what I mean? There's always that fear. So that's my fear with that. So moving on to the second one, if that doesn't work, even though I think that's the strongest one, is the Manhattan prosecutor's potential bank and insurance fraud case brought by Cyrus Vance, which is a criminal, which could lead to criminal charges and incarceration with Trump. So this one is a year-long investigation by the Manhattan DA into the Trump family business, stemming from, the business. They found out that Trump's lawyer, Cohen, paid the hush money to Stormy Daniels, the adult film star, in 2016. And that was a campaign finance violation, which, was not that great. Michael Cohen did go to jail, but he went to jail for lying to Congress. But he wrote a tell-all book about that. And we can talk about that another time, because that's also chock full of interesting things. And for those of your viewers that don't understand a lot about election finance laws, don't worry, nobody does.
Right.
But basically, an individual can only contribute $2,700, and Michael Cohen's hush money payment to Stormy Daniels was $140,000, I believe, and that was an in-kind contribution, so it also counts. So that's why that was an issue. So during that probe, what happened was they found out about, from Michael Cohen, because he got in trouble, got disbarred and everything like that, not caring about his attorney-client privilege anymore. And he has provided the evidence, the tax returns. He famously said he knows where all the bodies are buried as his personal lawyer, and he has provided all that evidence to the proper authorities. And, I can't wait to see what that is going to turn up. But we both read the book, and we know that there's a lot of dead bodies buried, right? So that's one to look out for. And the strength of this case, I find it to be a little bit weaker on tax fraud than the one that I just mentioned earlier. Still very strong and on the top of my list. The third one, which is another strong one, I would say it's a tie between the DA and this one. And this is the New York State's Attorney General's office. And this is the civil fraud investigation. And it's basically very similar. They've been investigating the past year as to whether the Trump organization improperly manipulated values of certain assets to secure loans and obtain tax benefits that they otherwise wouldn't have been entitled to take. So the AG is investigating whether one of Trump's estate agreements to limit the use of land for conservation purposes was inflated for the purpose of taking a larger tax deduction that would have otherwise been permitted. So the strength of this case, I find it to be weaker, but it's on the top of my list, and it's weaker because a lot of people, like a lot of business people can make that argument, that like their accountants, like, do like inflate this and inflate that. Like, so this one seems a little bit weaker to me, but those were all the tax ones that I kind of wanted to get out of the way that I thought were plausible. Then we get to the ones that I don't think are as plausible, but still not federal. So defamation lawsuits from the sexual misconduct. So Trump has been accused by 2 women who have alleged that they've been sexually assaulted by Trump. They're not charging him with a sexual assault because the statute of limitations is already over. So no criminal charges associated here. The strength of this case, unfortunately, I think is weak because sexual misconduct cases tend to be very difficult to prove. So it's sad as a woman, but it's the reality of the situation. So, but I wanted to mention it anyway, because it's definitely an outstanding case that will be a thorn on his side. And Trump himself, he has litigated 4,000 lawsuits in his lifetime in the past 3 decades. So he's no stranger to litigation. So, I'm sure he's a tough opponent in those kind of cases. And then I don't know if you have time to go to the federal side of things.
Please, just give us a sort of a brief intro of the federal cases, because I think all those, those lawsuits are fascinating. Please just go on.
Yeah. Sure. So let's briefly discuss the federal cases, since I don't find them as exciting because much of these potentially unlawful actions taken by Trump during the presidency can too easily be derailed by a pardon, by, Biden's DOJ saying, hey, we're reluctant to prosecute. We don't want to further divide the country. Biden himself said he's not going to grant pardon to Trump. He's going to defer everything to the DOJ, which brings me much joy because in the past, however long William Barr was in the DOJ, he was like Trump's personal lawyer, and that's not how it's supposed to work. They're supposed to be completely separate. So it makes me happy to know we're returning to some traditional norms. So so I think there's going to be a reluctance there. They're going to have to weigh the public backlash versus, do we want to hold this person accountable? Personally, I think, yes, we must hold him accountable because this is an incompetent Trump, in my opinion, right? But had he been competent, right? Had he been competent with the coronavirus, he would probably still be president, right? And that's scary. So we need to, make sure someone like Trump never, comes back again. So that's one thing. So the first strongest case I think we have is the violations of the Moments Clause in the Constitution, and that prohibits Trump from accepting Trump and other government officials from accepting gifts from foreign governments. And Trump's hotel in D.C., as you know, has benefited greatly from his presidency. He hasn't fully divested his businesses, despite what he said. His Eric Trump is still running them, and how can they not be talking about the business at Thanksgiving dinner? I don't know. But I'm like, I don't know if that's true, but I'm just thinking, educated guess. And this is hugely problematic because this is exactly what our founding fathers' exact fears were, that our government will be under the influence of foreign powers through bribery, through gifts, and other enrichment. And that's like the core of, what they were concerned about when they were writing this constitution, drafting this constitution. I think this is one of the stronger federal cases because it's easier to prove. With documentation, easily prove that Trump's hotel business in DC benefited while he was president. Then we come to the Mueller obstruction of justice. It's a very valid legal claim. He basically came out and said, had Trump not been president, we would have prosecuted him, right? And his only saving grace was that he was president. And I just think everyone is so sick of the Mueller investigation that it's just not going to get that public support, even though I think it's so important to still go after him for that. But practically speaking, I don't think the support is there. I think everyone's just, even the Democrats are just kind of like, we're done with this, you know,
Right.
which is a travesty, but oh well. There's so many other things that Trump can go to jail for.
Right.
And a big question on everyone's mind is the DOJ going to go after Trump for these federal crimes? Joe Biden made it very clear he wants to stay out of everything, right? And the DOJ is meant to be independent. And to me, Trump clearly violated several laws. There's the Hatch Act that he violated, you know, and also violated the Constitution, in my opinion, as well. I'm sure other legal scholars would disagree with me, but that's my opinion. And that's a tough decision to be made by the DOJ. So that's on the new AG. Good luck to them. So in conclusion, even though I don't think the majority of Americans currently have the appetite to stomach another drawn-out legal fight over Trump's more nuanced violations of the Constitution, and even though I think it's very crucial that we hold Trump and any future president and government official accountable for the actions to prevent a more powerful and a more competent Trump version 2.0 to come along and really undermine our democracy. And even if it's very unpopular among the American population, I still think we should go and do it, because if we don't pursue the wrongdoing, we're saying the president is above the law, and we're a nation of laws and nobody's above the law. So that's the message I think we should be sending out, whether it's popular or not.
When we were in political science class back in high school and college, we were taught that the main function of the U.S. Constitution was the control of executive power, right? So curtailing president who might seek to become tyrants, and preventing the republic from, lapsing into dictatorships like the Roman Republic. But, throughout the 4 years of Trump presidency, this elaborate system of checks and balances, the electoral system, there seems to be something wrong with it. And, as I read through the news and people's discussion about that, it seems like I'm not alone here. There are legal scholars who think that as well. So I'm also curious about your legal opinion on that. What are some of the flaws in our Constitution and our electoral system that could potentially be exploited, if not by Trump, but by a future mini version of Trump, say, Josh Hawley or someone like that.
Right. Or someone worse, who knows? Right. I wholeheartedly agree with your assessment. Trump has definitely revealed the underbelly and the flaws in our system. He especially tested and exploited, in my opinion, the ambiguities of the Constitution and ignored long-standing traditions that we all took for granted, thinking, oh, this is, the law. And turns out it's not the law. It's just customs and traditions. You don't have to follow it. So as a lawyer, I was shocked that Trump was able to get away with so much that at least seems to me to be violations of the Constitution. But I am very, very grateful that Trump actually did come to power, because he did expose those flaws. And, I know a lot of people disagree because there's Trump supporters, but I personally think he's a bit incompetent or not up to the task of being president, at least, right? And so it doesn't seem like a lot of his stuff was done with malice. It was more incompetence, right? Like the mistakes he made, the phone calls, he just didn't know. And I doubt our founding fathers imagined Congress would not be a check on the president. I don't think they imagined that the entire Republican Party would be held under siege by the cult of personality of Trump, and frankly, fear of violence from his supporters too. I don't think they ever imagined that. So, and that's the great thing about our Constitution, because one of your questions was, does the Constitution need to change? And the answer to that is, the great thing about our Constitution that I absolutely love is the Constitution is intentionally ambiguous. intentionally short, intentionally open to interpretation in order to be like this living, breathing document that is adaptable to fit all the times. And that's why we have, amendments, right? Like in the beginning of the Constitution, only white males with property could vote, right? And then we expanded that. Was it until the 1900s that women could vote? I mean, so it's a slow and steady progress, and it's getting better. So I have faith in the system. Joe Biden's election is, a testament to that faith, I think. So I think there's that. I think another important issue, you were saying, what changes will we make to the election process or electoral process?
Right.
So I know a lot of people are angry with the electoral college. Me personally, I'm not as angry with the electoral college. I think it should be there because I think a lot of people, especially New Yorkers, city folks, myself included, before going to law school, before opening a trucking company and visiting all these rural areas, I thought New Yorkers were the typical American. And then you go out and you meet all these other Americans and you're like, wow, every state is like its own country, different culture, accents are different philosophies, and we can't just, take our New York, New California city like mindset and rule by them. So I think, one of the changes that, we need to make to better reflect the concerns of all the Americans is to keep the electoral college in place, because if you go to Iowa, let's just say, you drive through Iowa and there's just like miles, acres of farmland, right? And one family owns that. And I feel like they deserve that representation too. Like they shouldn't get screamed out by the millions of us living in New York, because we don't understand the plight of someone in Iowa with a farm, right? So I feel like they should have more say in a way. The bigger issue that I find that would make elections fair, instead of abolishing the electoral college, is to fix the gerrymandering issue, yes, which you and I kind of touched upon, yes, earlier in the previous conversation.
Great.
And gerrymandering, just briefly, like Dummy 101, is they'll draw these congressional maps in a way where it's not a square. It's like a squiggly line. It looks like a Rorschach dot, psychological test where I'm a registered Republican and most of my neighbors I think are Democrats. My next door neighbor and I don't go to the same polling place. How did that happen? Right? We're right next door to each other. But it's because, they're like, hey, she's a Republican. Let's draw her in. And that's an issue. And I thought that the Supreme Court would step in last year with the court ruling saying gerrymandering is unconstitutional. Instead, they disappointed us all. Not by saying gerrymandering isn't constitutional, but by saying this is a political question and we don't want to answer it. So punting it off to, someone else, and I think abandoning their duties as Supreme Court justices. So I think that would be a great fix, but I don't think that's going to be fixed because of the 2020 census. It is going so awful, and that's what we use to kind of determine how to do the congressional mapping and who gets what resources and everything like that. So I don't know. Hopefully that'll change, and that's my biggest issue, and not the electoral college.
So this is our first time to chat on our channel, but I'm sure we'll invite you back when there are other topics that strike us as interesting and our audience would like to get your insights on. Yes. So Thank you so much, Angel. It's been super helpful. So what I will do is I will add some show notes to the show, including the gerrymandering maps you just mentioned, and sort of a brief discussion of the lawsuits you mentioned in this interview, so our audience can sort of refer back to those notes and get a better idea of what's going on there. But thank you so much. This is such a helpful conversation.